pleasure to introduce Deacon Yoseph Romanwork, who has been working, as the ambassador mentioned, in the forefront on this subject. So allow me to say a few words about him. Deacon Yoseph Romanwork is chairman of the Ethiopian American Civic Council. He is also a successful business owner for over 40 years in Colorado. The Ethiopian American Civic Council, or known as also EACC, is the largest and oldest civic organization that advocates for human rights and justice in Ethiopia, with 750,000 subscribers. It was the first civic organization to hire lobbyists and PR firms to fight the TPLF. Deacon Yosef is a widely regarded expert on Ethiopia and Horn of Africa geopolitics. One of his notable achievements was he co-authored the Human Rights Bill H.R.128 and provided congressional testimony. H.R. 128 passed the United States House of Representatives with a unanimous vote. The bill supported civil and religious liberties in Ethiopia and condemned the TPLF. He not only has compassion and love for Ethiopia, but also loves and mentors the diaspora community as an ordained minister and spiritual leader at St. Mariam Ethiopian Orthodox Church. He's a proud father of 3 grown children and lives in Colorado with his beloved wife of 39 years. Please welcome Deacon Yosef. Over to you, Deacon Yosef.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I want to also thank the panelists, especially Her Excellency Ambassador Hirut. Thank you for giving us truly the fundamental points why we have to come together as people, as one unit to defend Ethiopia in this consequential time. I want to address in particular what are the outcome or subjected sanction elements that are being proposed in these 2 resolutions. To do that, allow me to go back maybe to make some reference of the genesis of this truly draconian measures back to late October, November, what was happening. It just happened that, if you recall, sanction measures, of course, varies in so many ways. And I think President Biden said it right initially, and he said back in September that his idea about putting a sanction on regarding to Ethiopia is going to be focused surgically to the leaders of the country. And so he was listed Eritrean and Ethiopian government officials. He's put forth an executive order to put sanction on them. Well, the trouble about that, and by the way, when he said that, I think the most important point he made is that he wants to do this in order to avoid making any kind of sanction measure against Ethiopia that will affect the ordinary people. And that is an important point for us to all of us to remember. But essentially, that executive order that went to the State Department and the Treasury Department in seeking to enforce the executive order, essentially came back empty-handed. They couldn't find any assets held by government officials and overseas. And essentially, they basically said they couldn't find any significant financial assets to bear the executive order. So now by the way, this executive order was issued on September 17. Come around October, November, they knew they had to do something else. And that means the first measure they have considered was to eliminate Ethiopia from the privilege of AGOA. And that came about, the thoughts start to come in about November. About that time, we were making a point of trying to persuade some of these policymakers that this was a contradictory to what the president stated, and that as we make our plea, and in one of those important meetings that we had with some of the policymakers, it just happens that there was an assessment that apparently the U.S. intelligence groups have made about the situation in the northern part of Ethiopia, especially where the TPLF was conducting offensive military campaign against the Amhara and Afar regions. In that, without us asking them, because we went there to meet with them to talk about why AGOA should not be taken away from Ethiopia, they basically voluntarily kind of expressed, first of all, they said, we're not taking sides. And that's, I guess, is a standard way of saying, basically, they siding with the TPLF. Okay, and then the next from that is what they said, is that we believe that the cessation of hostility between the Ethiopian government and TPLF is very unlikely. And then they said, we believe that the Ethiopian government will prevail. Okay. Just as we are finding this of what their opinion is based on their own intelligence report, a gentleman by the name Senator Bam Mendez for the first time penned the Senate Resolution S3199. That was November 4. This is a very important timeline that we need to keep, because they get the same intelligence report just like the State Department and everything else. They knew the outcome. Now, officially, they were saying people need to evacuate Ethiopia, diplomats need to leave the country, the capital is about to fall, and so on. But internally, this is what they really are, in fact, believe what was going to happen. So they have to have another plan that, in effect, will make TPLF survive politically. And they want to make sure that in the political discourse of Ethiopia, that TPLF remains relevant. So if, in fact, the military campaign TPLF launch wasn't going to be successful, there has to be another backup plan. So these resolutions are born out of this, nothing more. And it's all about their own interest and how they calculate and arrive to the fact that TPLF, in fact, is going to be the ones that they're going to rely to enforce their interest. Having said that, then after the fact that the counter-offensive measure has really pushed back TPLF back to their own region, and that the current status quo was once established, what they wanted to do is they did not want these resolutions to pass only in one chamber of Congress. Because if that happens, it becomes a simple resolution. And a simple resolution, by its own definition, is non-binding. They cannot force the administration to take it up and then really make sure that what they want out of those resolutions actually come into play in terms of policy matters and everything else. So what they did is they took it down to the lower chamber, the House, and Representative Gregory Meeks, who also chairs the Foreign Affairs Committee, championed the cause. And now it got a new name called H.R.6600. But this whole thing, its genesis, it starts from the Senate. The whole purpose of this is by having these two resolutions advance in both chambers, that when they converge, they become a joint resolution that technically will be binding. That means it has very little to do with the administration prerogative, what to do with this resolution. It needs, obviously, they may send it to the president's desk for signature. So what is in this resolution? And to recap, just in a very, and why we're opposing it. First and foremost, that the demands contained in this resolutions, and both resolutions, by the way, is about 90% the same because born out of this, from one author anyway. So what you've got is the situation in Ethiopia is an ongoing, quite acutely developing situation. And as such, the demands that are put onto this back in November do not take into account the reality on the ground in Ethiopia. Here are the things that we make sure that the provision contained in this resolution are invalid, that it does not put into account that has taken place to satisfy the demand in this document. It asks for the Ethiopian government not to have an offensive military operation against Tigray. Offensive, the word is offensive. We all know that the Ethiopian Defense Forces, along with the special forces, did not incur into the Tigrayan region and have, in fact, till this day, are in a defensive posture. It doesn't take into that account, and that's one thing that they demand. They also demand that the emergency decree to be lifted. That has taken place. They also demand that a national reconciliation and dialogue to bring all opposing parties to come to the table. It demands that. Well, Ethiopia, for the first time in its history, thanks to the parliament that ratified a new law to launch this independent commission to do that. Ethiopia freed many political leaders, including members of TPLF. Doesn't take that into account. On access for humanitarian aid, the truth that was mentioned by Her Excellency Ambassador took place just a few days ago, maybe last week. It doesn't take that into account. We can go down the list. There's further point that we're making. So what we're saying is, if this is in fact a constructively engaging resolution, it needs to take into account of what exactly is happening here. And by the way, all of these measures that the government has taken, it has not done so for the pleasure of the United States. That the government looked at this and made these decisions for essentially in the interest of Ethiopia, and that is all. But yet, the demands in these resolution yet still ask for these things to take place as if it never even occurred. Because of that, we're demanding that the Speaker of the House and also Leader Chuck Schumer in the Senate not to allow these resolution to advance to the floor for consideration. Now, the sanction measures, and I know I can get to be sometimes very long-winded, and I apologize about that, but I'm asked to discuss the sanction and what it is all about, and therefore, essentially, what ties all of this, the demands and the potential sanctions that they are proposing, what ties it is the fact that they demand an independent investigators to enter Ethiopia and have a full unfettered access to do their own investigation. This is in the fact that the United Nations Human Rights Council has issued a report, so is the Ethiopian Human Rights Council reports. It doesn't take that into account. On any allegation of human rights violation in this resolution, it only talks about a 7-month period when the Ethiopian forces actually were operating inside Tigray. So it doesn't say anything about what TPLF has committed as documented on Amnesty International. But the biggest problem on these documents, the linchpin is that so-called independent investigator. Now, who's going to select these independent investigators? Well, it turned out they were able to maneuver the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva. As you heard yesterday, it was on the New York headquarters. They have elected 3 members countries to be in the team as investigator, independent investigator, and that is United States, Kenya, and Gambia. We know about United States, but who are the 2 other ones? In fact, it is individuals that have known to carry the water for the United States. So this is actually Team USA now demanding to have a full unfettered access in Ethiopia. And Ethiopia this morning has said no. And I think that's a reasonable answer. If this does not comply, meaning if Ethiopia does not comply to it, therefore the sanction measures, they are basically threatening us, is to literally cut Ethiopia's from the international financial grid for a long period of time. And it would have a severe consequence, like our brothers and sisters who have faced similar measure in Zimbabwe. And unfortunately, sanction measures never achieve what they intend to do. As you and I speak today, there are over 40 countries that are facing sanctions. Some may not be as severe as planned on H.R. 6600, but many are. But guess what? None of those governments in those countries has either complied to the demand of the United States, nor have they collapsed. But the people, like the ambassador said, are the one who's going to be paying the heaviest burden. And last, I want to point out that if this sanction regime is to be applied, God forbids, from both chambers that this goes and it gets its day and becomes a joint resolution, the president can veto it. But let's assume that he even signed it and it becomes law. I think every Ethiopian needs to understand it may not affect all the regions of Ethiopia the same way. Why? Because there are 3 regions, Tigray, Amhara, and Afar, that have gone through the most heart-wrenching devastation because of this war. And the current estimate that could vary, it goes from 5 to 7 years to do the post-war reconstruction, to rebuild these devastation back to where it was. Under this sanction, it may take more than a generation to achieve it. And that's why, and particularly Ethiopians who are from these particular regions need to be extremely conscious about how they go about advocating to support or not support this issue, because this thing is not going to uniformly impact everyone the same way. But in any event, it's easy to put sanction, but it is the hardest thing to lift it. That's why 90% of the sanction that the United States has put has still remain in effect. That's why we have to fight this tooth and nail. And maybe in a different Zoom session, we can discuss some of the things that we're doing. There are some promising things, but there are several challenges. And I would like to say, but in my core belief, that we will win this battle. We have to win this battle, because if this measure comes to reality, we may not even recognize a country that this resolution will leave behind. So I want to thank you. Sorry that I took more time than I was allocated. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity.
Rutendo Matinyarare is a renowned Zimbabwean anti-sanction activist who is the chairperson of Zimbabwe anti-sanction movement and founder of Zimbabwean Unite Against US War Sanctions. His anti-sanctions activism is driven by his position as a brand architect, marketing strategist, and CEO of Through the Line Marketing and brand consultancy known as Frontline Start Marketing Consultancy. Rutendo has been in marketing for over 25 years and has developed that knack of telling a good story. He is also a fellow of the Institute of Marketing Management of South Africa alongside the Chartered Institute of Marketing in UK and Prince 2 project management practitioner who can make unpopular issues mainstream without a budget, as he has done with sanctions. Over the past 3 years, he has been an integral part of Zimbabwe's fight against US, UK, and EU sanctions on the country after convincing the government to depoliticize its fight against this economic war by launching a national, regional, and continental legal and publicity campaign against these crimes against humanity. So not too long after that, in July 2021, for the first time in 20 years, meaning since imposing sanctions on Zimbabwe, the US Congress Committee on Global Human Rights, Health and Organization approached to inform them, his organization, to inform them that they will be undertaking an impact assessment of their sanctions on human rights and health in not only Zimbabwe, but the whole of Africa, with the intention of eliminating the impact of sanctions on civilians. Rutendo's key competencies are knowing how to tell a good story. So, Brother Rutendo, welcome again. Over to you.
Thank you so much. And I would like to apologize for my lighting. I was invited to come to Harare for a meeting. And that's why I was also late, because of the meeting. And I probably will leave a bit earlier than necessary because I have to meet some important people on this very same issue. So what I bring to the table today is I want to talk about how to fight these sanctions by going beyond politicizing the fight against sanctions, where our governments try to negotiate with the sanction sender for the sanctions to be removed, for us to take the fight to the next level. So as an example, I heard the gentleman from Eritrea talking about how Eritrea was put under UN sanctions, and on top of UN sanctions, they were put under US sanctions. And this is what I want to address. Unilateral sanctions that are not UN sanctions are illegal. They are illegal at international law. They are illegal according to a resolution that was made by the UN Human Rights Council that is called Resolution 3413. And that 3413 was actually came after 2721 resolution of the UN Human Rights Council. All those resolutions say that unilateral sanctions are illegal and they violate human rights. They deny civilians the enjoyment of their human rights, and they also give remedies, particularly in UN Human Rights Council's Resolution 3413. It actually says that countries must mitigate sanctions. Those countries that are put as third parties and asked to impose sanctions as third parties must not impose illegal unilateral sanctions, and banking systems, financial systems, companies, software companies, and NGOs should not implement illegal coercive measures. And so because we've got that law, because we've got the UN Charter, any country that imposes sanctions unilaterally outside the UN is actually breaking international law. And that is why you see that the Iranians, who were found to have proliferated the nuclear treaties, was put under UN sanctions. And when the United States decided to add more sanctions, to put more sanctions over and above what the UN had put, the Iranians went to the International Court of Justice. They sued in the International Court of Justice, and the International Court of Justice discovered that the sanctions being imposed by the United States upon Iran were illegal. They were violating human rights, denying the Iranian people medicine, food, payment clearances that allow the Iranian people to enjoy their basic human rights. And I think it's important for us to just quote some of the basic human rights that human beings are entitled to. And I might not be able to give you an exhaustive group of human rights, but I'll give you the basic ones: social, economic, cultural, political, and legal rights. Then we've got the right to life, the right to economic development, which comes as an economic right, and the right to life, the right to freedom of movement, freedom of expression, political freedoms, and democracy. All these are things that are denied by sanction senders. When they sanction a government, prevent a government from being able to give its people services, they punish municipalities, they deprive municipalities of money, of loans, and multilateral loans, and the ability to get balance of payment assistance to local governments and national governments. What this does is it then prohibits or hinders people from getting good healthcare, water, healthcare, food, education, social services, and the ability to deliver services to the citizens of those countries. And it is incumbent on the citizens of those countries, as the UN Human Rights Council's Resolution 3413 says, to actually fight to mitigate those sanctions, to bust those sanctions, and to go out to third-party countries and governments and ask them not to implement those sanctions. Now, what we have done in Zimbabwe is after 18 years of these sanctions, we began to read about sanctions. We began to read the laws around sanctions. We began to read what it is that the Special Rapporteur for Sanctions was writing. We went further and began to read what the Special Rapporteur who measures the negative impacts of sanctions was also saying. And then we went to our government and we said to our government, it's time to legalize the fight. It's time to make the fight against the sanctions upon our people a legal fight. Now, in Zimbabwe, they tried to tell us that they were targeted sanctions on politicians who had who had violated human rights, and that those politicians were the people that were targeted. When we began to read the sanctions, we realized that the sanctions did not really target the politicians. The politicians were put in the front, but when you read the fine print of the sanctions themselves, particularly the executive orders actually prohibit people doing business, making clearances for our government and the state and its municipalities, its state enterprises, and any organizations or companies owned by the government. So in as much as they put targets in front of us, at the end of the day, the sanctions are on everybody in Zimbabwe, and anybody that wants to do business in Zimbabwe, wants to clear funds for the Zimbabwean government, Zimbabwean companies, needs to get a permission or a license from the US president. And without that license, those people are liable to be given secondary sanctions, to be arrested, put in prison, have their properties confiscated, not only in the United States, but other jurisdictions that are supposedly partners of the United States, and also prohibited to do business or trade with any other companies or organizations and institutions and banks across the world that want to do business in the United States. Because the United States has got a policy that says that you're either with us or against us. And within that, they will always implement their sanctions through the fine print and through the written document, but they also exert what is called bilateral pressure with other countries and third parties. When they have bilateral agreements, talks, and these nations come together, they ask them to implement sanctions. They talk to insurance companies all across the world and ask particularly reinsurers not to insure transactions from countries upon which the United States has got executive orders. And I would think Eritrea is under those executive orders. Zimbabwe is under those executive orders. There's a time that Burundi was under those executive orders. Congo has got some executive orders on it. And also Iran, Afghanistan, Syria, and a number of other countries. So what we began to do is to dig into this, to understand that, let's say that they were right, that there were some targeted individuals. Are the sanctions on targeted individuals legal? When we began to read closer, we realized that sanctions are punishment. And a lot of times people are punished by these sanctions without ever having an opportunity to be tried in a court of law, a competent tribunal that has the jurisdiction to be hearing the case in the first place, and that they are actually being tried for existing crimes and then being punished accordingly by a code that exists, for those crimes with the appropriate punishment, which are the sanctions that they give. And we realize that there is no law that tries people for these human rights violations in individual countries outside the UN, outside the UN Human Rights Council, that has the equipment, the tools, and the multilateralism to actually investigate and come up with conclusions as to whether people have violated human rights. And then they come up with their own punishment. And by the United States and their allies coming up with punishments without trial, they're actually breaking what is called the Universal Bill of Rights. They're punishing people without trial. And that is a violation of human rights. Then after they've done that, they go beyond these so-called targets that they talk about and impose sanctions on an entire government. And what that does, it begins to collectively punish disproportionately and indiscriminately and unreasonably civilians. That in its own respect, whether it's done during war, according to the Geneva Convention, is a war crime. And when it is done in peacetime, it is a crime against humanity. So when sanctions are imposed, even on targeted individuals who usually are your investors, the politicians, and the people with money in a society, those people then become unable to create jobs. They become unable to invest in an economy. They become unable to develop the nation. And thus, it becomes collective punishment of civilians, which then becomes a crime against humanity, while the violation of the rights of those so-called targeted people is a violation of the human rights by a contravention of the Bill of Rights. When we began to understand this, we began to understand that we've now got a case to approach courts. And we have a number of options on the courts that we need to attend to. And we began a fight in South Africa where we've launched a case because South Africa is the biggest trading partner of Zimbabwe and is the biggest trading partner of many countries on the African continent. And many transactions, particularly banking transactions, financial transactions, investment transactions, come through this gateway that the Europeans created, which is called South Africa, to then disperse money throughout the continent. And so we decided to start our legal action in South Africa against South African financial institutions that have been implementing these sanctions illegally. Why is it illegal? Because the laws that are being used to punish most African countries are American laws, created either in the American Parliament or a combination of the American Parliament or what we call Congress, together with laws that are being made by executive order by the American president. When the American president asks for those sanctions to be adhered to or to be implemented by foreign nations, what those foreign nations are doing is they're implementing US law in their own territory without the permission of their own parliaments, which is what we call extraterritorial imposition of law, and that is illegal. So we're taking the law of another nation, imposing it on a sovereign nation, yet the UN Charter is clear that all nations are sovereign and no nation is greater than the other. So when that law is taken from America and superimposed in a foreign nation, that is colonialism. That is what it is that the it's actually 1315, or is it 1813, 1815, the decolonization declaration or decolonization treaty does not allow for nations to be forced to implement the laws of foreign nations. Not only that, we then have this foreign imposition of this law in a foreign country, and then international law, which is this resolution that I've been giving you, Human Rights Council Resolution 3413, says it is illegal to impose unilateral sanctions. So when a bank in South Africa or financial institutions in South Africa, or organizations in South Africa implement these sanctions on behalf of the United States, they are taking something that is already an illegality and they're enforcing an illegality in South Africa. And in South Africa, they're also going against South African law, which says that everybody must be tried before they are punished. They're also going against South African law, which does not believe in breaking human rights law, which is this collective punishment of civilians. So we are starting in those courts to stop the financial system of South Africa being used to implement sanctions on Zimbabwe. And I would say to any other African country that is also suffering under these sanctions, go and look and see which African institutions, which partner states are implementing these sanctions on your country. And if you find that out, then begin your legal action there. Why? Because for law, international law to be crafted, it needs a contribution of custom that is being made in our courts, or what is called precedents that is made in our African courts pertaining to this international law. So every time an African court finds against these illegal acts upon Africans that violate international universal human rights, that begins to feed into decisions that can be influenced to take them to the International Court of Justice, which is the court of the UN, or we can use them in the International Criminal Court. That then begins to have lower courts making rules, making judgments that begin to have an impact on international law, giving life to a lot of these international treaties and international agreements for the benefit of Africans. So that is Africanizing law, or making the law of the world part and parcel of African law, so that we can begin to be seen as human beings and our humanity asserted by these particular actions that we take in African courts. We will go then to other jurisdictions where we've got big trade partners, Nigeria, Kenya, and other countries, and try and get precedents, and not precedents, but custom made there. And once that happens, we can then take these judgments straight to the International Court of Justice and the African Court. But another reason we're doing it is, once we can stop African institutions on the African continent and have these sanctions declared illegal in Africa, it's going to be very difficult for the Americans to use bilateral pressure to pressure third parties in Africa to implement sanctions. It also allows us to confiscate their properties when the courts rule in our favor and give us damages or compensation or reparations, which the resolution that I spoke about, 3413, insists that we must have a special rapporteur come, measure the impact of the sanctions, and then from there, we must claim damages, reparations, or compensation. So this is the advice that I'd like to give to the Ethiopians that are facing a possibility of sanctions, that you need to join us in the cases that we're running right now, so that you can begin to use that as petitions to members of the Congress, as petitions to members of the US government, as petitions to the US president, to say, any law that you write now will become voidable in future if Zimbabweans succeed in their cases against you. You also need to start conscientizing the business people in America, the banks that are going to be asked not to clear Ethiopian payments, Eritrean payments. You need to start writing to them now as institutions to say, listen, the laws that you will be breaking if you institute these sanctions are international laws. You'll be committing crimes against humanity. You'll be perpetuating crimes, international crimes. You will be breaking human rights law. And by so doing, you are giving us the right to pursue you in courts for damages and to take your properties in Africa, if indeed we go after you and we win, because we've already warned you, and you should be able to foresee the consequences of you violating the human rights of Africans. And you need to remind them that we are human. You cannot break international law on the pretext that you're punishing animals, because you're punishing human beings. And if you can't do this in Europe, you surely cannot do this in Africa. And if you're running around saying that Russia is breaking international law by attacking Ukraine, then you have to accept that if you impose sanctions that are illegal and implement them against people, against governments, in a manner that deprives Africans of their human rights, including the right to life, including the right to health, then you too are breaking international law, and you're doing it deliberately, and we shall pursue you. You should also then inform those businesses that you, as businesses in America, Canada, Australia, and Europe, and American partners, have a right to refuse to implement illegal sanctions. And you have a right not to be deprived of your right to trade in Africa and make money in Africa, while China is taking up that position, Russia is taking up that position, because you're implementing illegal sanctions because your government forces you to do that. So what you're now doing is you're getting businesses in America mining companies in America to join you in your struggle in solidarity to sue their own government for trying to get them to implement illegal sanctions. So we are talking to these companies now to say for 21 years, you haven't been able to deal with the resources in Zimbabwe. You haven't been able to deal with the uranium. You haven't been able to get platinum. You haven't been able to get chrome. You haven't been able to get strategic mineral resources because your government forced you to implement illegal sanctions. And you've lost billions. So you must sue that government together with us. I think we've lost signal. Hello?
We hear
No,
you.
no, we are hearing you.
Okay.
So you need to wrap up.
So these are the strategies that we want you guys as Africans to start understanding, that we must have solidarity. We must have solidarity as a people, but we must also take our story as a people to the rest of the world to say that our rights are being violated, our humanity is being compromised. And then we must also get solidarity from NGOs, humanitarian organizations, to make them understand crimes against humanity are happening against us through these illegal sanctions. And then eventually, we must get the solidarity of the parliaments and the businesses of those countries. Thank you so much. I won't be able to stay long because I've got some ministers that need to have a meeting with me. So if possible, if there are any people that have got questions, am I able to answer them quickly before I need to go?
Thank you, Brother Rutendo, for that. There are questions which are directed for all, really. Thank you very much for that presentation. Yeah, let me just go to the questions since you said you're leaving. There are questions that are directed to all. Just give me some. One is, can governments of all the countries that suffer under these unfair sanctions get together and fight the sanctions regime at the International Court, or make this an agenda of a meeting at a UN General Assembly meeting? That's from Dr. Azeb. There is also another one, which is a related question, which says, for example, for the second bill to be approved for the H.R.6600, there are only 19 days, if I'm not mistaken. That's what it says in the question from Sister Jasmine. Can Ethiopia take the sponsor to court, if that is possible at all? Yeah, you may start with that, Brother Rutendo.
Thank you very much. So first of all, I think, yes, all African governments can come together and start to have a legal class action, or at least to become friends of the court in any jurisdiction where cases are being heard on the issue of sanctions. So if you, for instance, have the issue of Zimbabwe right now, Zimbabwe is isolated, and we, at least as a civil society organization that is taking these sanctions into the South African court, we are isolated because we're going into this court alone. We're going into a court that might be hostile because this country that we're going into a court of is being controlled by the Americans through American debt and American investment and Western investment. So they might use pressure of those investments to pressure the South Africans. So other nations can join us as friends of the court with an interest in this case because it has bearing and public interest for them and their nations. And so that will pressure the judges to make a decision that is legal, but it will also begin to put gravitas upon other African courts and other African countries to look at this issue as a very important issue in Africa when they make their rulings and judgments. Then when we take these decisions and we get it in our favor, that is now precedence and case law that you guys can now use in future. Then when we go to other jurisdictions like the African court, you can actually join collectively against the sanctions that are on one country so that we can also have the same gravitas on the case and eventually do the same in the International Court of Justice. I am not a legal person. So I would need to find out the legal reading as to whether countries can come together as one to put in joint cases against a sanction sender that continues to be a common denominator like the United States. So I'll need to find out that. The second question is can you remind me what the second question was?
That says it has been now there are 19 days for the other bill to be approved, and in this time can Ethiopia take the sponsor to court? But let me add, there's one specific also to you from Sister Asquat. Resolution, I think RES is representing resolution 3430. How is it defended and enforced? Also, who is the entity that can enforce such laws against the US? How likely will it be enforced?
All right, thank you so much. So the first question is that I don't know if you can take legal action against the Parliament of the United States outside the United States Parliament, unless you've got people within the United States who can begin to take the Congress to task as citizens of Ethiopia that are living in the United States, or citizens of Eritrea that are in the United States, then they take the Congress to court for unfairness or a lack of judicial process in their declaration of sanctions. So I know, and I can almost guess, that nobody has been tried in any of these countries that are going to face the sanctions. Ethiopia is being alleged to do something that has never been tested in a court. So that means there's no due process. So what I would suggest is that the citizens of Ethiopia that are living...
Yeah, okay, now it's good. It's good.
So what I would suggest is that the citizens of Ethiopia that are in the United States now need to take the judgments that have already been made against the United States in Iran versus United States in the International Court of Justice. You also need to take the ruling that has been made by the UN Human Rights Council Special Rapporteur who came to Zimbabwe saying that unilateral sanctions are illegal because they lack due process. Take these cases and begin to get your lawyers to try and to get an estoppel or a spoliation for this process that is taking place in the Congress of the United States. Also write letters and petitions to the President of the United States and Congress people to say that the process you're undertaking is illegal because it is punishment without trial. You are punishing people on allegations, therefore violating international law, violating the Bill of Rights, violating the principles that you say as a nation that you stand up for. Then you also warn them that if you do continue and do not desist, we will then sue you in African courts, in the African court, in the International Court of Justice, and eventually hold you accountable for decisions. Then you can also go against them in a civil case to say that you as sponsors of this bill and you as Congress people of America have sat and decided to make decisions that are contrary to international law, in violation of international law, and contravening what you say the United States stands for, a policeman of human rights when you're violators of human rights.
It's a shared challenge that we face all over the world, and especially as an African. This is exactly what Deacon Yoseph also told us. If this sanction is imposed on Ethiopia, this is exactly how it looks like. In a way, I think if I can say, every challenge has an opportunity. So these countries, by going through this, also they brought not only they are sharing their challenges, but also the guideline how to fight it. So we really appreciate that, and thank you very much, Brother Rutendo. Yeah.
Thank you, my sister. Thank you, my sister. And I'm sorry that I couldn't stay longer. And let's hope you have more of these. And I promise I'll stay longer. If it wasn't for the fact that I've got meetings pertaining to sanctions, I would stay.
Okay. Now we understand, and we heard you also in the Twitter space. We know that you are committed, and definitely this is not the last time. Okay.
Thank you. Good night. Good night, guys.
Good night. Okay, so we are through with our speakers. We started late, so I took the liberty also to take some time from what is allocated, from what is mentioned as the end time, but also we need to give time for the question and answers. So I really apologize. So let's go straight to the questions. The first question, I think on the last question that Brother Rutendo touched. There are some legal where he said he's not a legal person. So maybe Ambassador David, if you have been following that, you may want to give us more analysis or more answers. You may want to respond on that. While you are preparing, I will go to the questions which are directed to Deacon Yoseph Tafari. You're here with us, right? Before I read the questions. Deacon Yoseph. Okay. So yeah, the first question is who is from Hermela? It says who is behind the bill, meaning financing or supporting? Do we have a company name? And then it goes on saying we need a company name behind the bill, sponsor of the senators. For instance, Senator Mendez's campaign was sponsored by, she mentioned 3 companies. One is Blackstone Group, Southern Star Shipping Masters. The other one is Garcia Hamilton and Association. And the third one is Alisa's Bakery. Yeah, and then there's another one from Endalk. How should citizens and those outside the country jointly stand to advocate against the bill? Over to you, Deacon Yosef.
Very well. That was an unbelievable discussion. I don't know if I remember anyone ever putting together such a powerful team of panelists. They really have an in-depth, and I've learned a lot, and I'm sure the rest of attendees too. But I want to thank you guys for putting this thing together. It is truly something that needs to be taken as a model, and hopefully that we get to do this again, across the Atlantic as well. So thank you for being such an exemplary, putting this seminar together. I hope it's recorded and posted on social media. Yes, question that Hermela asked, this is obviously, okay, so obviously this is backed by interest groups. Primarily, if you could divide this between the TPLF backing and Egypt. What is obviously, we know, as far as TPLF is concerned, they have a wherewithal. They had all the looted treasure that has been used as a war chest against Ethiopia. And we've seen it throughout last year. The misinformation and all of the avalanche of false narrative that have come about as a result of their money, the ill-gotten money that is now affecting the international media, academic institutions, government policymakers, congressional members, and whatnot. They have, we know that they have 3 lobby firms. That's not something that in Europe that you're familiar with, but that's the way how these political campaigns take place here in the United States. And the other one is Egypt. Egypt has been extremely forceful. They also have probably one of the most powerful lobbyist firms from what they're known as a K Street firms. And each individual lobbying firms are paid between $65,000 to $75,000 a month. And one of the key lobbyists representing the interest of Egypt is has somebody who was actually a chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee inside in Congress for many, many years. And one of the influence that they have done is not only that they have co-wrote the, H.R.6600, but also to make sure that a resolution to really have a teeth to it, some power to it. It goes after the leadership of Congress, which they were able to do. So Senator Bob Mendez and Representative Gregory Meeks, both the Foreign Committee's Affairs chairman, as I indicated earlier, are captured by these lobbyists. And the second thing is, you need to have, this is key, you need to have co-sponsors that agrees with the resolution, and they become essentially co-author of it. And in the case, for example, of H.R. 128 that we were able to successfully pass back in 2018, we had over 200 co-sponsor among a body of 435 congressional members. In this case, it has only 5 congressional members that are co-authors. However, Egypt's lobbyist firm, led by the ex-congressman Ed Royce, was successful in putting out of the 5, 3 of them were brought by his pressure representing Egypt. So if you really want to see this, okay, if you really want to see this, clearly this is highly driven by interest groups, and namely TPLF in Egypt. Now, I want the audience also to understand that officially, the administration is saying they don't support H.R. 6600 or the Senate resolution. They're saying that, not only here in the State Department, but as a special envoy, Ambassador David, reconfirmed that in his visit last week with the Ethiopian authorities. But that's the official. This is the way how they play this game. The classic case of the carrot and the stick is essentially this. They make the other branch of government, which has an equal authority in many aspects, not necessarily foreign affairs, but at least they make them draft resolution like this. And so on the other end, they seem to argue that the best way to go about influencing what happens in Ethiopia is through a diplomatic process. They're saying we need some kind of leverage to make our demands heard by the Ethiopian authorities. And that leverage comes in the form of such resolutions. And obviously our point of argument is obvious, and that is, if the president doesn't agree with this, if the State Department openly, in fact, in one of the congressional hearings, the Assistant Secretary of the African Affairs, Ambassador Molly Fee, when she was directly asked when the State Department is going to come about and coming up with a legal determination, in fact, Ethiopia is a state of genocide, she outright rejected that. She said, we will not espouse that. We don't call upon to that. We believe the best way to go about achieving what we're interested to take place in Ethiopia is through a diplomatic means. Now, when you hear that, and it's the Congress asking the question and advancing a resolution advocating for such determination, and then the State Department officially, and this is in the congressional record, and I believe I tweeted the clip, the video clip on my Twitter feed, and people are welcome to go and look and just hear word to word how she responded. Then one question, how is it then the congressional part of we know it's an equal branch of government, but yet foreign policy by United States Constitution is virtually the presidential prerogative. That means, and that's why you've got doctrines, the so-called, Truman doctrine, Obama doctrine, Kennedy doctrine. Essentially, foreign policy is really a pleasure of the administration, the White House. Okay, so which essentially, through the instrument of the State Department, impose those policy, what's in the minds of the president. And then you've got Congress behind it coming up with these kind of draconian measures that literally opposes what officially they are claiming, we are saying to Congress and said, number one, that this contradicts the administration, which these resolutions are asking and demanding for the administration to comply with the resolution for determining Ethiopia and the way that they would like to be categorized. That actually is contradictory to what the administration believes should have been the course of and the way how they go about this. Now, the other part, which is probably more sensitive to them, is the fact who is the political party that is in power currently? The president is a Democrat, the Senate is run by the Democrats, and the House is run by Democrats. So we have a simple question to the Democratic Party. Why are you embarrassing your own president when he's officially telling you that the best way to deal with Ethiopia is through constructive engagement? So we're using this divide, and could be a ploy, and we shouldn't rule that out. But yet there is a unique opportunity here that, based on the actual record of testimony they have given, that they do not believe that Ethiopia should be categorized in such manner. And finally, the question and the second guest asked about how one can participate. We have a petition drive on the change.org. If I may request, maybe Asqual, if you can post that on the chat, a link. Anyone around the world can sign this petition. What does this petition ask? It asks the Speaker of the House not to allow advancing this resolution, H.R. 6600, to come to vote on the floor. And by the way, we will amend it now. Now we've seen the Senate has also advanced S 3199 and cleared the committee, is now queued to go before on the Senate floor. We're going to amend the petition to include also Leader Chuck Schumer, not to bring this for consideration. If you could do that for us, it's extremely helpful. And also, please add your name to hashtag withdraw 6600 on the Twitter campaign. I think from what I've heard yesterday, for the first time, we have exceeded the support that was in the Twitter platform that was promoted by people who are trying to support the resolutions for the first time. And that's a good thing. And I heard some numbers like we have now exceeded them by threefold. I think we need to do that because we have the numbers and the convictions, and I would recommend that we do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deacon Yoseph, for that.